welcome to the first episode of 5 Art Questions. Today I have the pleasure to introduce Betty Briceño. Betty Briceño is an art business MA art graduate from the Sotheby's Institute of Art in London. She also holds a bachelor's degree in international relations from Universidad Central de Venezuela, as well as a postgraduate diploma in cultural management and museum studies from Universidad Autónoma de México. And she has worked both in the public and private sectors in the art world, more specifically in Museo de Arte Latinoamericano in California, as well as managing the collection of Mexican artist Pedro Reyes, based in Mexico City. Thank you, Betty, for joining me today in 5 Art Questions.
Thank you, Denise. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
So we're going to start with the first art question, which is, what are the main changes the art market is going through with the pandemic?
Well, as the world in general, we're going through so many changes. I would say the most evident one would definitely be the shift or the transition towards the completely analog to virtual. And I say completely to use a word because the art world in general, especially the visual arts, is very traditional. And we like, of course, to appreciate and have that aesthetic experience live. So although we've been having that transition towards the virtual, it's been going on for the last years. Now, let's say we're picking up on in a faster pace, and we've really had to put our hands deep into this subject. So we're seeing now more online viewing rooms. We're seeing even the presence of digital art and new media art, which was also a big thing during the past few decades, really, has really become an issue and a topic of important discussion right now. So I would say that, like, the presence of the virtual in every sense.
Definitely, it had to speed up in an unimaginable way.
Yes, that's a good way to say it. It really speed up the process. It really speeds up the process.
So as I was mentioning, Betty is specialized both in modern and contemporary art, more specifically in Latin American. So that's why I wanted to ask you the second question, which is, how will this pandemic affect emerging markets such as the Latin American market or the Caribbean market right now?
So it's hard always to talk about Latin American art market, especially because the Latin American construct is so difficult to define. We all know that, and I always say that we're never Latin Americans or Latinos until we come to America. You know, suddenly we're all grouped together in this big construct. But in general terms, I will try to reference more the market, how it initiated. The construct initiated really in the auction houses, how they wanted to group these emerging economies from Hispanic and Portuguese speaking economies together in the same category. So that has been changing already in the past years. We see some big auction houses that have been eliminating those departments and incorporating the Latin American artists to their main category in sales. In terms of the pandemic, I feel that it's a great opportunity for smaller markets, or let's say the emerging markets, to really have a platform. We know that outside the main art markets, we know the main art markets are always the financial centers in the world. New York, Hong Kong, and London always have that main platform of the art world. However, as we see that these centers, especially London in the West, London and New York, is very difficult now to access because of the pandemic. I think that it's a great opportunity for emerging markets to actually, they're the ones that are actually opening now. They're opening first. They're the ones that will definitely set a precedence on how the new normal will be. So I think especially centers like Mexico City, which is a great, not only emerging market, but I think it's one of the, now that the world market is becoming more polycentric, it's one of the great markets that we should look into. So definitely, I think that it's a time where they will tell us how we're going to adapt. I think, especially, we saw South Korea was the first one to open. maybe Mexico City will be the first one in our region. We don't know. So we'll definitely keep an eye on that. But I think it's a great opportunity.
I agree, and it's funny that you mentioned how auction houses were the first to sort of categorize that Latin American sense, because it is true that all Latin American countries are very different, and what it is to be Mexican or what it is to be Venezuelan is us, or what it is to be Colombian, it's very different. It's different, and it's hard to encompass in just one category, Latin America.
Absolutely, Denise, especially when it comes to the markets, because they're all very different economies. Although we're all commodity producing emerging countries, each one is very different. The fiscal policies are different. The monetary policies are different. Our two main markets, Brazil and Mexico, they react very differently. One, Brazil is very protectionist, has very strict rules to import an art piece into the country. Mexico, on the other hand, is very open, and that has allowed it to connect itself with other great art markets in the world. So it's difficult when we talk about the market to group them together, because although culturally we do have many links, many things that connect us, especially of course the languages. When it comes to markets, it's tricky. It's tricky. Yeah.
So that brings us to the third question, which is, what are the challenges that Latin American artists face, and what are the forces, or what forces do they struggle with today?
So talking to a lot of friends and colleagues, especially artist friends, of course, when it comes to their creative process, they're finding this time really to be isolated, which most artists really love. They crave for that isolation, for that time of introspection. However, when it comes to the materials and sometimes even visiting the venues where they're having an installation, a special commission, that has become a challenge. I have seen that in terms of those artists that are working more with painting, sculpture, and traditional media, how they're really struggling to juggle or to incorporate the virtual, or present. How do you present that piece in a virtual way to attract the collectors or the dealers eye in a first stand? So that, when it comes to the medium and the creative process, that could be it. And of course, that in the end, they rely on the main markets. I mean, we know that for artists, Latin American artists, to really make it, sometimes they have to be connected to the central art centers, to New York, to London, Hong Kong. So when they don't have that access, they can't travel 3 times a year or 2 times. Those who can, we're talking about the top tier, of course.
Yes.
That to travel regularly to these centers, it's hard to keep themselves connected. But we'll see how it continues. To how I think it's too soon to tell still. But again, I try to be optimistic and see it as an opportunity for them to really work on their creative process and take advantage of the isolation. Yeah.
Yes, I can imagine that regarding accessing materials, also sometimes accessing their own studios may be.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's why the virtual sometimes helps. But then they have to challenge that as well. So they have
Yeah.
that challenge as well.
So the fourth question is, what city or cities do you consider to be the center of the Latin American art market? Which I believe you already sort of answered by mentioning Mexico City and Brazil, but go ahead.
Again, going back to the construct, we would say first New York, naturally, because they invented the construct. But outside New York, I would definitely say, like you mentioned, Mexico City, I think it's a phenomenal place. Of course, historically, it has all the infrastructure, even the economic ecosystem. Although we know the economic growth, the rate is very sluggish in Mexico, it's still pretty steady. They have a wonderful fiscal and monetary system that really helps the art market flourish. So I would definitely, number one, Mexico City, of course. Sao Paulo, although it has many challenges, it's still together with Mexico, they're the biggest economies in the region. So I would, of course, mention Sao Paulo, though we know the Brazilian economy has suffered a lot in the past years. Buenos Aires, we can't forget, also a big cultural background. I would even mention Bogota. It's been growing little by little. The art market there, it's very interesting. Lima, Havana are also very important centers to consider. And little ones, very little markets like Guatemala, it's growing. It's a very interesting scene, although it's not as big as or like in Santiago de Chile as well. They're not as big. They're still very interesting art scenes to study. Unfortunately, others like Havana and Caracas, they have great artists and great infrastructure, but we know that for many political and economic reasons do not have that platform that other economies have.
Or the push to actually be able to grow and become.
Absolutely. But they survived elsewhere. They survived in the diaspora.
Yes, they do.
In Miami.
Exactly. So the fifth question, which is very connected to the prior question, is what are some of the most notorious Latin American artists today?
That's another very difficult question because, again, we know that they're either categorized by top performances in the market, but in general, I could, of course, name those artists that we'll see in the museums. And we have the top performances from auction houses or main sales and fairs, which are, of course, Gabriel Orozco, Abraham Cruz Villegas, Minerva Cuevas, Teresa Margolles, Pedro Reyes, all from Mexico. From Brazil, I could name Beatriz Millajes, Adriana Vallerão, Ernesto Neto, Isildo Meireles, Vic Muniz, of course, Tania Bruguera from Cuba, from Venezuela, of course, we're both Venezuelans, we could go on forever, Javier Telles, Alexander Apostol, Juan Araujo, Miguel Braselli, Maestro Sigfredo Chacón, Alberto Cavalieri, Erika Ordosgoiti, Sol Calero, I think I named her. Yeah, just so many wonderful artists from Colombia. Of course, we have Doris Salcedo, Oscar Murillo, Santiago Montoya. Don't forget, a lot of them don't even live in Latin America anymore. But that does not deny that they are from the region, and a lot of their work is related to the region. That's what makes it so rich, I think. Yeah.
100%. I agree with you. And also, it's very hard because there's so many categories within the art. There are also amazing performance artists as well. And
absolutely. Exactly. It's hard because if I name the top market performers, I'm leaving out others that not necessarily have that financial boom.
Yes.
They're the ones giving the symbolic value to the market. So it's like you say, it's very difficult to have, to measure. But I'm just naming a few that we'll see all the time because they're in the museums, they're in the private collections. But we could definitely do another top 5 or 5 of many emerging artists that deserve it. Yeah.
Amazing. Okay, so thank you so much for being the first guest in 5 Art Questions. I loved the interview and your answers were amazing. And stay tuned for the next 5 Art Questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Denise. Bye.